So a very warm welcome to all our viewers and welcome to a new edition of Africa Today, our show that brings you all the latest news and events happening all around the African continent. I'm Angie Meher and I'll be joining you with today's edition of the show, and we begin straight away with a look at news from home, where Egypt's exports to Africa have surged 13% year on year to $6 billion between January and October. A statement was made by the Ministry of Trade and Industry. We have more details in this report. Stay tuned.
The Ministry of Trade and Industry said Egypt's exports to Africa surged 13% year on year to $6 billion between January and October. It said top Egyptian exports to Africa were marble, cement, polyethylene, and phosphate fertilizers. It also said the recent figures superseded expectations by the Egyptian Chamber of Chemical Industries at the Federation of Egyptian Industries (FEI), which estimated exports to Africa to $5.5 billion. The ministry said that in June, the volume of trade exchange between Egypt and the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa (COMESA) countries reached $4.3 billion in 2022. Egypt's trade deficit declined by 23.59% according to the ministry during the fiscal year 2022-2023. It said this is primarily due to a significant decline in non-oil imports.
And still with more news to Sudan, this time violence continued in the country, with the latest development involving the Rapid Support Forces moving further south and reports of mass killings and violence streaming to the media. We have the details.
On Saturday, at least 8 people were killed by RSF fighters in a village in Al Jazeera state in Sudan, as witnesses said they had been shot after trying to stop their looting. Just south of Khartoum, more than 500,000 people had sought shelter in Al Jazeera after the fighting overwhelmed the Sudanese capital. The UN said that this month paramilitaries pressed deeper into the state and shattered one of the country's few remaining sanctuaries, forcing more than 300,000 people to flee once again. Those who remain unable or unwilling to leave have found themselves in what the Red Cross has called another death trap. Since April 15, Sudan has been gripped with a war pitting Army Chief Abdel Fattah al-Burhan against his former deputy RSF commander, Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo. By the end of November, at least 12,190 people had been killed in the fighting, according to a conservative estimate from the Armed Conflict and Location Event Data Project. The UN says more than 7 million people have been displaced by the war. At least 85,000 had sought refuge in Wad Madani. In the village of Aikura, 30 kilometers north of Wad Madani, one resident said that the RSF has taken everything: the cars, the trucks, the tractors. He too stressed the need for anonymity to protect him from paramilitary violence.
Now moving to the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the country's Electoral Commission released further early results of the presidential election, suggesting a strong lead for the incumbent leader, Felix Tshisekedi. We have more details in this report.
In DRC Congo, the Electoral Commission suggested a strong lead for incumbent leader Felix Tshisekedi. The results announced by Commission so far account for nearly 1.9 million ballots out of a total of around 44 million registered voters in the vast Central African country, the size of continental Western Europe and with a population of more than 100 million. The Commission said 60-year-old Tshisekedi, in power since 2019 and seeking a second 5-year term, was leading with more than 81% of the vote. Following was business magnate and former Katanga provincial governor Moise Katumbi, 58, with just over 15% of the vote, and ex-oil executive Martin Fayulu, 67, at just over 1%. The other nearly 20 opponents, including 68-year-old Nobel Peace Prize laureate Denis Mukwege, failed to gather 1%. The Commission has not established turnout rates of the December 2021 polls, but has still been gradually releasing the results since Friday, which include legislative, provincial and local elections.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and we're now delighted to be joined over the telephone by His Excellency Ambassador Midhat El-Maliki, the former Assistant Foreign Minister. A very good afternoon to you, Mr. Ambassador.
Good afternoon to you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for joining us this afternoon. And let me start by asking you, as we wrap up the year, looking at the African continent, how do you see some of the major achievements that have occurred in the African continent, despite the woes globally as well as regionally?
Well, actually, Africa this year, 2023, have struggled a lot with many hurdles that came on the way. And unfortunately, I mean, if we take Africa as a continent, we see that it's expected to recover in 2024 because for the current year, 2023, the growth is set a little bit to fall compared to 2022.
Yes.
I mean, the numbers that were revealed throughout the continent this year show that the growth rate is set to be 3.4% approximately from 4% in 2022. But we are expecting it to rise once again to 3.8 in 2024. These numbers are coming from the African Development Bank, which is the best source for numbers, economy numbers in the continent. But
Yes.
as you know, I mean, the long-term effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, combined, of course, with the Russian-Ukrainian war, which actually has destabilized the chain of supply, created some problems to the African continent. Of course, we cannot compare all the countries to each other and have one set of records for all of them. I mean, some countries have done better than others. What I'm talking about is the average of the African continent.
Absolutely. Now, Africa has been predicted to be one of the world's fastest growing economies. How do you see these impacts of the international events taking its toll with regards to this prediction, Your Excellency?
Well, there are two factors. First, there are the external factors, which actually are represented here by, for instance, the war, the Ukrainian-Russian war. And second, of course, the implication of many European countries, which are the main importers of African raw materials, and it's the implication of their involvement with NATO forces in the Ukrainian war to supply Ukraine with arms and so on, which actually slowed down the economy in Europe and accordingly in Africa. This is one of the major external factors that affected the economy in Africa. Internally, as you have seen, there were many political destabilization topics throughout the continent. I mean, if we take Central Africa, for instance, the Central African Republic, Sudan, if we see in the West, and the coup that took place in Gabon and other countries in the Western Africa, especially those who are linked with the French economy.
Yes.
So there are some internal things. Of course, in the East we have Kenya and their problem with debt and trying to reschedule their debt. So there are some important factors that actually affected the global economy in Africa.
Absolutely. Now, Your Excellency, of course, one of the main topics or pressing issues with regards to the African continent was that of illegal immigration to Europe. However, we have seen a decline in such numbers. How do you read the declining of this number, and what are your expectations for the flow of migrants in 2024?
Well, of course, there were many conferences regarding this issue. And Europe actually contributed a lot to several programs in many African countries to try to stabilize those countries in order to reduce the flow of immigrants towards Europe. And from the other side, many countries in Africa also start to face their own problems, whether about lack of jobs and so on, in order to absorb the youth and work power that cannot find enough jobs. And this was one of the major factors that Europe contributed in. Having said that, of course, Europe also, on the other hand, secured more and more its borders, making the issue of immigrants much more difficult than it used to be.
Yes.
So there are several factors compound together gave that result to reduce a little bit this wave of immigrants that used to traditionally take boats or any other means to go to Europe in order to find better jobs and better futures.
Absolutely. Your Excellency, let me ask you, what steps do you think need to be taken to further increase intra-African trade? Lots of agreements have been inked recently over the years to encourage more intra-African trade. What do you think needs to be done in order to reach a better level of this kind of trade between African countries?
Well, first of all, Africa, and here I'm talking about mainly the African countries that are traditionally used to export their raw material towards the market, the European and the Western market in general, and Japan. Those countries need to start to do any industry regarding their raw material. The idea, and this is a very important issue, as you know, I was ambassador in one of the major important Central African countries. And one of their main exports was wood. So
yes.
what they used to do is to export wood as it is, as chunks of trees, actually. If they would do any kind of transformation industry towards that wood, at least the sale price would augment by 10% or 10 times more, actually. So this is the major thing that African countries need to do, which is to do any transformation industry to the raw material and not to sell it just as pure raw material without doing any transformation on that substance. And
So
this will help them to increase their GDP by exporting with higher figures. Second, we have to find a more fair and right price to the raw material of the African countries.
yes.
We've seen in many products of Gabon, for instance, and other African countries who had problems with France, and they made even some coup to change the government and the presidency that is in tight relation with the French government. And we found that the price of the raw material augmented about 20 or even more times from the original price they used to sell it with. So we have to find the right price of the raw material and not just let the importing countries decide the price of this raw material. I think it's a very important step towards reforming the shape of the trade between the African countries and the Western countries that are basically and traditionally the importers of this raw material.
Indeed. So you're calling for a need for industrialization in many African countries in order to increase their competitiveness.
One point here is that due to, as I said, to the war of Ukraine and the implication of many European countries in this war by supplying more arms to Ukraine to defend itself against Russian invasion. Unfortunately, that across the continent, there were weak exports and demand due to the lack of importation as it used to be. Not to mention, of course, the high price of borrowing money now, which actually caused a lot of African problems not to be able to borrow money to establish new industries in order to help themselves to have that transformation of the raw material. So as you know, it's a circle, and it's not just one factor. There are several factors combined together.
Absolutely. Right, I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there as we've run out of time. I'd like to thank you very, very much, Your Excellency Ambassador Medhat Al-Maligi, the former Assistant Foreign Minister. Thank you very much, sir, for all your time and your insight and for joining us on today's edition of Africa Today. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all the time we have. You're in the company of myself, Angie Meher. Thank you for joining us.